For those of you who joined us for previous presentations, today we're going to zoom out a little bit and talk a bit more about our conservation work in Kansas more broadly. Rob Menis, our state director, is going to share some of our history with you and also talk about where we're headed and highlight some of our preserves and key projects as well. Rob's been with the Nature Conservancy since 2005 and was named state director in 2011. He's spent more than 35 years in the conservation field, including 20 years with the Kansas Department of Wildlife, Parks, and Tourism. So with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Rob to get started.
Thanks, Kelly. Really appreciate it. And I appreciate you saying that I've only been in this field for 35 years because I think I'm going on 41 now. And I just want to say something about that. Early in my career, I asked a room full of biologists, how many of you, when you were a child or a young adult, maybe new in your career, said out loud at some point, I just want to work in nature and be kind of a hermit and maybe live in a hollow tree or something. And about 3/4 of the people in the room, there were about 100 people in the room, raised their hand. And that's kind of where my heart was at the time also. Since then, my heart about my work has changed. What we do is so much about people and so much about the well-being of people that it's really changed the way I view my own personal engagement in conservation. And after 40 years, I see that what we do is for nature, but also for people. And that very thing is exactly why I'm so grateful and proud to be part of the Nature Conservancy. And it's why I'm so grateful to each of you for being part of the Nature Conservancy. In particular, I had mentioned trustees who are actually on the call right now, Steph Turner and Roger Zellers and Melita Lowry, Dr. Chuck Rice, Gordon Elliott, Kenny Baum. I think that's all that are on there. I just really appreciate the fact that you all support us so powerfully. Bill Lyons is on now, I see. Support us so powerfully. I guarantee you that each of these trustees has that same recognition that this is about people and nature in tandem. Just so you know, I'm a Kansan primarily. I've lived a little while in Arizona, a little while in California, and a little while in Missouri, but I've been in Kansas almost my entire life, growing up in Pratt and Ellsworth County, and I now live in northern Wabaunsee County. Really fortunate to be where I am, doing what I am. So thank you all for joining us today. You can go to the next slide, Kelly. The Nature Conservancy, can you click us? There we go. The Nature Conservancy has a motto that reflects what I just said in terms of my personal values, and that is conserving the lands and water in which all life depends, and that all includes people. Their lives, their livelihoods, their cultures, the quality of their lives, their families, their happiness, and importantly, in this time, their health is so tied so tightly to nature. Another important tenet of the Nature Conservancy's work is that what we do in terms of conserving lands and water and wildlife and natural systems is only durable to the extent that it's good for people. And that durability has lacked in some of the work that I've done in my career because we haven't been respectful of the needs of people. And the Conservancy, I believe, is really successful in large part because we respect the needs of people in our work, making it more durable. We also base it on the best available science and on collaboration with other entities. We'd like to talk just a little bit about the history. Go ahead, Kelly. The history of the Conservancy very quickly in sort of a universal fashion. And many of you have heard this before, so I'll go quickly. Conservancy's roots go back to the 1950s when the Ecologists Union came together and changed its name to the Nature Conservancy and did the first land acquisition of the conservancies in the Mayanis Gorge near Bedford, New York. There, a pristine piece of old growth forest was about to be cut over and developed. The landowners in the area joined with the Nature Conservancy in the mid-1950s, and they bought that piece of property to be managed in perpetuity for its natural values. Then in the 1960s, the Nature Conservancy started to exercise something called conservation easements, and I'll talk just a little bit more about those in a minute. But conservation easements were a way for the Conservancy to conserve large tracts of land, literally for pennies on the dollar of what it would cost to buy them. It was the beginning of the recognition that we could never buy enough land to conserve ecosystems, that we would have to do things much more economically efficiently. In the 1970s, the Natural Heritage Inventory was launched, sort of illustrated by that middle picture there, the guy looking at the tree. And the Natural Heritage Inventory essentially was the first broad-scale effort in North America to inventory the natural assets across the country, state by state. In Kansas, that became the Kansas Biological Survey and was spun off to the University of Kansas. Similar transactions happened in almost every state where there are biological surveys housed in universities. That was started by the Nature Conservancy. A lot of people don't know that. In the 1980s, the Conservancy's recognition of the importance and the interconnectedness of large natural systems manifested itself in the fact that we began to work internationally. In Canada, in Central and South America, in Africa, and other places. And that evolved in the 1990s into something we call conservation by design, which is simply a system for bringing the very best science to bear to bring about the largest scale conservation possible, often spanning entire continents, sometimes hemispheres. And then in the 2000s, what I mentioned earlier began to manifest itself in the Conservancy's work, and that is a recognition that what we do is about people and has to benefit people if it's going to be durable for nature. Next slide, please. And so we adopted a mantra of creating a world where people and nature thrive. Today we're in all 50 states, in more than 70 countries around the world, very focused on ensuring healthy lands, protecting existing pristine lands and fresh water, restoring healthy oceans, and in particular, over all that, making sure that we do the very best we can to guard against the impacts of climate change. And I'll come back to that in a minute, but the reason climate change is such an overarching issue is because no matter how well we do in freshwater conservation and land conservation and ecosystem conservation and species conservation, the impacts of climate change threaten to undo much of that. In Kansas, looking at the next slide, in Kansas, we're focused on some key areas, and I don't think any of these will surprise most of you very much. Go ahead, Kelly. Premier among the areas we're focused on are the Flint Hills, which represent the last ecologically functional landscape expression of tallgrass prairie in North America. Tallgrass prairie once stretched all the way from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico, and functionally what's in Kansas and northeastern Oklahoma is all that's left. Go ahead, Kelly, through these. The Red Hills, the Flint Hills, by the way, are about 4 or 5 million acre landscape in Kansas and Oklahoma. The Red Hills encompass 2 or 3 million acres in Kansas and northwest Oklahoma. Again, that's one of our newer focus areas. I think the next one that we'll talk about is the Chalk Bluffs region, where we have Smoky Valley Ranch and Little Jerusalem and Badlands State Park, which we'll talk about shortly. The Smoky Hills, where we've had a long-standing partnership with the Kansas Livestock Association's Ranchland Trust, also about 2 million acres. and then some extremely important wetland projects in Cheyenne Bottoms and Quivira National Wildlife Refuge in that circle. And then I think we skipped over our stream system, the Kansas River system. There we go. Kansas River system, as well as the Blue River in this oval, are very, very important areas. Come back to the Kansas River in a minute, but about 1 out of 4 people in Kansas get their water from the Kansas River system in some manner or another. Also, we'll talk about under streams, places we're working in central Kansas, the Rattlesnake Creek, the Blue River near Kansas City, the Republican River near Junction City, and heritage streams in the Smoky Hill, or in the Red Hills and in the Flint Hills. All right, Kelly. Probably best known among the places that the Nature Conservancy has purchased in Kansas is the Konza Prairie Research Natural Area, just south of Manhattan. It's operated for us by Kansas State University. Acquisition started there when K-State bought 900 acres in 1971. It is preserved and operated, as I said, under agreement, a long-term agreement with Kansas State University's Division of Biology. Today, it's just under 9,000 acres. Really important there is the fact that Konza hosts a long-term ecological research program where very, very long data sets. Ecosystems don't operate in the same timelines as graduate student research projects. And 3 years is simply not enough to look at changes in ecosystems that are being examined under fire and burning regimes there that now span 30 years in some cases. And the opportunities to observe changes in ecosystems over 30 years is really unique to places like Konza. Climate change is a big part of the research there, and we're learning things about how climate change impacts grassland ecosystem. Just as an example, we know that fire, too frequent of fire, can be a threat to species like prairie chickens in tallgrass prairie. But we also know that increased atmospheric carbon benefits the very woody species that we don't want invading grasslands. As a result, we have this dichotomous set of data, one that says, well, we might need a little more fire because of increasing atmospheric carbon. Another one saying, but if we have too frequent of fire, it's a disadvantage to species like greater prairie chickens. We only learn those things through long-term ecological research. And the data coming out of Konza has global impact. And there are researchers there from all over the world. Really, really important place. We're proud and grateful for our partnership with Kansas State University there. Next slide, please. The Flint Hills Tallgrass Preserve down on the Butler-Chase County line is really, really important to us in terms of research. There we're looking at fire research on tallgrass prairie, also trying to launch some research on controlling invasive species like Sericea lespedeza and Old World Bluestem. It's only about 2,100 acres, but very, very important for as a research site. Those two pieces of property were acquired actually before the Nature Conservancy in Kansas was formed in 1989. One of the things that I would always like to point out to people is when the Conservancy in Kansas was formed in '89, that formation, that was driven by an oil and gas man by the name of Wayne Liebsack. And Wayne saw the extraordinary need for landscape scale conservation in Kansas, showed up at a meeting of the Nature Conservancy in St. Louis and said, how do we get started? Wayne has passed away now, but I just want to tell you that he was a great inspiration to me. Kansas was the third to the last state to have a Nature Conservancy chapter back in 1989. And almost immediately, the Nature Conservancy turns its attention to Cheyenne Bottoms. I happened to be working for the Department of Wildlife and Parks at the time, and we had all sorts of problems with land that the state owned at Cheyenne Bottoms, the flooding private lands. That problem was solved by the Nature Conservancy, and I felt a little like the cavalry had ridden in and rescued the Department of Wildlife and Parks and the dilemma that they had in managing wetlands at Cheyenne Bottoms by buying up flooded croplands. Cheyenne Bottoms acquisition started with 700 acres in 1990, and today we own almost 8,000 acres in addition to the 20,000 acre state-owned area there. We manage it in concert with the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks. It is one of the most important, in fact, some wetland experts state that Cheyenne Bottoms is the most important inland migration point in North America. As many as 5 bird species may depend on Cheyenne Bottoms for their entire population's survival. It's where birds stop in the fall as they migrate south to places like Tierra del Fuego and the far tip of southern South America and Colombia and Mexico. They stop at Cheyenne Bottoms to refuel to make sure that they have enough fat and energy reserves to get to their destinations in Central and South America. More bird species are seen there than in any place in Kansas and most of the Great Plains. Up to 250,000 waterfowl use Cheyenne Bottoms as a stopover. An incredibly important place, long-term heritage of waterfowl hunting there on the state lands, and it is also recognized under international treaty, the Ramsar Treaty, as an important wetland of global importance, and under the Western Hemisphere Shorebird Reserve Network. Really proud and humbled to be responsible for Cheyenne Bottoms. Go ahead, Kelly. Meredithine National Wildlife Refuge over south of Kansas City is a really interesting place. TNC was right in the middle of brokering the deal that created and expanded Meredithine back in the early 1990s. Interestingly, behind the scenes, Senator Bob Dole was an important and powerful partner in making that happen. It's adjacent to a state-managed wildlife area, and it's a bottomland hardwood wetland where waterfowl and other migrating birds stop to eat acorns right out of the water in many cases along the Meredithine River. Meredithine is really important not only to migrating to waterfowl and shorebirds, but also because there's a unique and large assemblage of freshwater mussels in the Meredithine River that flows through there. Lots of recreation occurs there, including hunting and fishing. And the Meredithine National Wildlife Refuge is one of the gems in the National Wildlife Refuge system, and we're proud to have been a part of establishing it. When I first came to the Nature Conservancy going on 16 years ago, we had just purchased a place called Smoky Valley Ranch out in Logan County, a short grass prairie site where there are bison, lesser prairie chicken, pronghorn, black-tailed prairie dogs, and black-footed ferrets. Smoky Valley Ranch is a truly amazing place. If you haven't been there, I suggest that you bundle up and head for Logan County. About 20 miles straight south of Oakley, you'll find Smoky Valley Ranch. Today, it's about 18,000 contiguous acres. Matt Bain does a fantastic job of managing it for us. And you can go there and see bison off in Smoky Valley Ranch. It also includes Little Jerusalem Badlands State Park, which I'll talk about just a little bit more in the future. There are 5 miles of public hiking trails on the northwest corner of Smoky Valley Ranch. It is a fantastic place. Conservation easements, I mentioned early on, are a really important tool that we use for conserving very, very large landscapes like the Flint Hills at a relatively low cost compared to acquiring land. Very quickly, I'm sure many of you know what a conservation easement is, but here's how they work, just in case you don't. Every piece of land starts out with a full bundle of rights, which includes developing oil and gas, mining, building houses, building roads, all the development rights that go with a piece of land inherently. A conservation easement is like any other easement in that it purchases away from a piece of land those development rights that conflict with its conservation values, with its natural values. In Kansas, we're almost always either looking at wetlands or at grassland values. So the development rights that would conflict with those things are things like building apartment complexes, or wind energy facilities, or mining. So for a very small fee, we work with landowners who voluntarily participate. We also work with USDA and other federal entities, and that allows us to purchase away those development rights while leaving the land in private management, almost always for private grazing management, which is highly compatible with the natural values that we're concerned about. We started using conservation easements in the Flint Hills, in Kansas, also in Oklahoma, where many ranchers are concerned about maintaining both the grazing and the natural values of their lands. So it's commensurate not only with the landowners' values, but also with the grazing economy and culture of the Flint Hills. We now use conservation easements across Kansas and across North America, as well as in other countries. Today, I think we have somewhere in the order of 160,000 acres of conservation easements in Kansas, and they are very successful and very popular among private landowners. Excellent way to conserve private property while leaving it in private hands. Anchoring our work in the Flint Hills is the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve. It is, I'm proud to say, a partnership between us and the National Park Service. The Nature Conservancy owns all but 40-acre historical area there, this 11,000 acre property. It was established in 1996. The Nature Conservancy purchased it in 2005 because the National Park Trust and the Kansas Park Trust were in a financial situation requiring its sale. There was a threat that it might be broken up into ranchettes or some other use that would not be compatible with its natural values, and the Conservancy was asked to come in and purchase it. I'm grateful that we were able to do that. I'm grateful that we're able to operate it for public enjoyment and for nature conservation with the National Park Service right now. There's 50 miles of trails at the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve, catch and release fishing, largely free roaming bison, so exercise caution if you go there to use the trails, and some amazing historical buildings, as you can see in the picture here, that are largely open for public viewing. The buildings, as I understand, are closed right now, but the trails are open, and we invite people to come there and enjoy this magnificent place. Just a quick story I'd tell. A member of the Nature Conservancy staff in China visited the Tallgrass Preserve with me one day, and she wanted two things when she came to the U.S. One was to see the Tallgrass Preserve. The other was to drive a pickup truck. And we were able to accommodate both those requests when she was there. And she drove out to the end of one of the roads there, and we stopped and got out, and she stood and she turned into the wind. And I remember seeing her with her hair and her sweatshirt blowing back behind her, looking out over a landscape that virtually has no sign of human impact on it. And she began to cry. And she was so moved by the vast natural landscape that we've conserved there in partnership with all of you that it brought her to tears. And that was a real telling moment for me. And I still hear from her every once in a while, and she's still moved by the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve. An equally impressive landscape is the Red Hills. Unfortunately, many Kansans don't even know the Red Hills exist. They primarily span Barber, Comanche, and Clark County. It's a 2 or 3 million acre landscape that extends into Oklahoma as well. Almost all privately owned. The Nature Conservancy has begun to establish a footprint there with private landowners using conservation easements. It is also where some of our most pristine streams exist in Kansas. It is a fantastic area. One of the other interesting features there, besides pristine streams and grasslands, is that most of the bat caves in Kansas exist in a little area along the Barber-Comanche County line. Many species of bats are found there, and it's very important as a conservation target because of those bats. Also in this area is Big Basin Prairie Preserve, a project that the Nature Conservancy did with the Kansas Department of Wildlife and Parks many years ago. St. Jacob's Well, a historic site where early settlers stopped for water, exists there. And it's just a fantastic place. Would encourage you to visit it. It's open to the public. Interesting thing about the economy, not quite yet, Kelly, about the economy and the natural systems of the Red Hills are that both are threatened by the expansion of eastern red cedars. Eastern red cedars are a major threat to lesser prairie chickens, to the streams in the area that they dry up by transpiring water into the atmosphere, and to the economy of the area. Some experts estimate that as much as $1 billion a year is lost from the grazing economy of the Red Hills by the invasion of red cedars, which, as I said, are native to the area, but their expansion has been facilitated by a lack of prescribed fire. So by helping landowners with training and equipment to put fire back on the ground, we can push back eastern red cedars, bring back pristine streams and species like Arkansas river darters and lesser prairie chicken, and create a more healthy ecosystem and a more healthy economy, which again is right at the heart of where the Nature Conservancy works. All right, Kelly, thank you. I mentioned lesser prairie chickens, and sometimes while we do focus on large landscapes and ecosystems, we also focus on species in need of conservation, like lesser prairie chickens at Smoky Valley Ranch, which, by the way, at Smoky Valley Ranch, if you go there during the right time of the year, you might hear lesser prairie chickens booming, as well as greater prairie chickens, which exist on the ranch, as well as hybrids, which have a very distinct call that is, curiously, sort of a mix between lesser and greater prairie chickens. We have, for example, a 30,000 acre conservation easement in Hamilton County, which is our largest single conservation easement, which is a stronghold primarily held just for lesser prairie chickens. I mentioned bison earlier, and one of the things that we are really focused on with bison is their come back from a total population in North America of about 400 animals, which is almost extinct. But as they've come back, a lot of cattle genetics, or bovine alleles, as we like to call them, were introduced into bison. But there are some bison that, as near as science can determine, are genetically pure. And we've made it one of our targets to have genetically pure bison introduced primarily from Wind Cave National Park. And you'll see those if you go to the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve or to Smoky Valley Ranch. You'll see those genetically pure bison. Other species have our attention as well. I mentioned Arkansas river darters, also species like Mead's milkweed and pollinators that depend on various and sundry milkweed. That's sort of where we've been and where we are now. I'd like to talk just a little bit about where we're going. And the challenges are much more complex as we look forward than they have in the past. It would be a lot easier if we could just stay focused on conserving individual pieces of the landscape. But we know that doing that doesn't ensure the health of the ecosystems, and lacking healthy ecosystems, those individual portions of the landscape are threatened in spite of our best efforts. So, as I mentioned earlier, very large landscapes like the Flint Hills and the Red Hills, the Smoky Hills, the Chalk Bluffs are really important to us. And we have to find ways to work with private landowners in Kansas and across the Great Plains using conservation easements, using sustainable grazing lands, using soil health practices to conserve those areas. As the human population increases, the demand for food and water and clean air increases, as does the pressure on landscape. So we find ourselves increasingly in conserving landscapes, not only for nature, but for people. The Nature Conservancy's heritage lies in land protection and in managing land, and we won't abandon that. In fact, if anything, we've doubled down on that work. As I mentioned, we're approaching 200,000 acres in conservation easements in Kansas, and our goal, we have a 5-year goal now to double what we did in the first 30 years of the Nature Conservancy's presence in Kansas. So we're working, as I said, very much with landowners to do conservation easements. We're also working to expand the footprint of scientifically managed grazing that creates economically sustainable ranches, but also recognizes the importance of well-managed grazing to ecosystems. And we're making great progress there in concert with private ranchers, in concert with the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, and other national and global initiatives. Go ahead, Kelly. One of the things that we won't forget is that we don't do our work unless we have the passion of people behind us. And I personally am very committed to the idea that people only have passion for nature to the extent that they can touch it, which is why we take projects like Little Jerusalem Badlands State Park very, very seriously. Little Jerusalem was a parcel of land that up till a couple of years ago was in private ownership, largely not accessible by the public. The Conservancy purchased it from a landowner who wanted us to buy it, and we've made it open to the public through a partnership with the Kansas Department of Wildlife Parks and Tourism. And I'm really proud of the fact that this property is now open. It's a very, very fragile property geologically and ecologically. So opening it to the public was something that we did carefully and thoughtfully with Wildlife and Parks, with Dr. Ryan Sharp at Kansas State, making sure that that access didn't threaten the well-being of the property. So we now have completed the acquisition. Department of Wildlife, Parks and Tourism has worked with us. They are managing visitor access there. And it is a fantastic place for people to go find that inspiration and that connection with nature. One of the most abused and neglected natural features in Kansas is its streams. To quote the statistic that is nevertheless true, and that is that 3 out of 4 stream miles in Kansas are unfit for one or more of the designated human uses, either because they've been dewatered or because the water's contaminated or for other reasons. And there's no one riding to the rescue of streams in Kansas right now. So the Nature Conservancy in Kansas, a couple of years ago, started the David T. Healthy Streams for Kansas initiative. We hired Dr. Heidi Mill, a brilliant stream scientist, to help us build that program, and we are well on our way now. We are working on the Blue River in the Kansas City area to protect its watershed and its floodplain, to make it not only more sustainable for nature, but better for human use and human benefits. Rattlesnake Creek Basin in south central Kansas is a basin where we have the opportunity to conserve the water resource there for Quivira National Wildlife Refuge, for Arkansas River darters, and for many, many migrating waterfowl that use the refuge and the creek. And I'm proud to say that we're making great progress there in a manner that benefits both agriculture and nature. Another example of our Healthy Streams work is on the Kansas River, where more than 1 in 4 Kansans get their water. And there we're working with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and many, many other partners to operate the dams there so that they create benefits to nature. Many endangered species use the area, and it's just a critically important area for us to be working with these partners. The Kansas River is home to a handful of endangered species that are federally listed, and we have the opportunity to conserve them, operating with the Corps of Engineers. I've mentioned wetlands a couple of times, and Cheyenne Bottoms is sort of our premier wetland, but I don't want to neglect to mention other wetlands where we're working, including Playa Lakes in western Kansas, Jamestown wetlands, McPherson wetlands, and the Talmo Marsh area. I mentioned some other wetland projects that we have going on. Kansas has lost more than 80% of its wetland resource, and the impacts have been felt by wildlife and by people in flooding and in water quality losses and loss of groundwater recharge. And one of our key focuses is in restoring and protecting existing wetlands. Just a few more minutes. I want to mention, go back to the issue of climate change for a second and talk about renewable energy and the importance of renewable energy. Kansas, along with our colleagues in Oklahoma, led the establishment of a science called Site Wind Right. And Site Wind Right basically recognizes the fact that we need renewable energy. We need to build out renewable energy as fast as possible, but we have to do it in a way that doesn't negatively impact grassland resources, prairie ecosystems, and the species that live there. And there are some serious negative impacts if they're built in the wrong areas. The good news is, if you use proper science, use good science, which is what's reflected in the multi-layered geospatial database of Site Wind Right, it's easy to find good places to build wind that build out wind energy that don't have negative impacts on wildlife and on ecosystems. Species like ground nesting birds and bats can be negatively impacted by wind energy development as well as by solar energy development. So we recognize that we can build out wind energy using this good science in places where it doesn't negatively impact ecosystems. In doing so, we can reduce atmospheric carbon, maintain the energy we need for a robust economy and a healthy culture, and avoid impacts to native species. I'm proud to say that this system that was started in Kansas and Oklahoma has now been expanded to all 19 states in the wind belt, where more than 80% of the interior wind energy capacity exists in the United States. Other renewable energy initiatives that we've undertaken include a push for energy in buildings, in commercial buildings. We've been pursuing a really important legislative initiative called Property Assessed Clean Energy. And the importance there is that we can encourage people to build more energy efficient and more renewable energy serviced buildings through finance. And I expect you'll be seeing more about the PACE system, or Property Assessed Clean Energy System, in the legislature in the coming session. We're also behind rooftop solar, and again, behind building out wind energy in an ecologically friendly and beneficial manner. Lastly, Kansas is an agricultural state, always has been, always will be, and we're very much involved with the agricultural sector, including organizations like the Kansas Corn Growers, Kansas Wheat Growers, in figuring out ways to use cover crops, to reduce tillage, reduce the use of chemicals to create more healthy soils that produce more healthy water. Attendant to that, we're involved with a project called Save Farm up in Riley County, which helps train veterans to create more healthy soils and more healthy waters by sustainable ag practices, and start those veterans on a career path in agriculture that is respectful of the need for healthy soils and waters. I am so pleased and so humbled to be involved with Save Farm, to be a supporter of it financially and scientifically, and to help veterans along this pathway. That's a lot to talk about. The Nature Conservancy in Kansas and across North America and globally is involved in far more than I can talk about in the time that we have allotted. This is expensive work. We need your help more than ever. Nature needs your help. Nature needs our help more than ever. And so I would be remiss if I didn't end with a plea for your help financially, but also for your help emotionally and politically. And stay involved, stay engaged. Let us hear from you. Thank you so much for your commitment to us. Thank you for your passion for nature. And I look forward to hearing, hopefully, from each and every one of you in the near future. And with that, Kelly, I'll pause and for any discussion or questions anyone wants to ask. And it looks like my video has died.
I'll throw a softball question. Rob, how can you compare the awareness and support for Nature Conservancy in Kansas compared to our peer states in the Midwest? Especially back when the Flint Hills was first being preserved, there was a lot of antagonism and so forth. Do you think that's changed over time? How do you think it compares to other Midwestern states?
That's a really good and not a softball question, Bill, actually. I would start, I guess, with when the Tallgrass Prairie National Preserve was established, there was a great deal of acrimony around it. Kansas has a very proud private land heritage, and I think there was a lot of suspicion about an organization like the Nature Conservancy when we began to look at acquiring it. And some people, I think, equate that to a lack of a conservation ethic. I don't believe that's true. A very strong conservation ethic, and we were a bit late to the game in establishing the Nature Conservancy here. And because so much of the world relies on Kansas to produce food inordinately compared to many other states, although not so compared to Iowa and Illinois and some of the others, the impacts of food production have been felt pretty heavily in places like our streams. And so, you know, in some respects, we've been behind the game in stream conservation and in land protection. But we are getting a head of steam that goes back 30 years. We're benefiting from that head of steam. And I think Kansans are very, very engaged, very strongly supportive of and the support for conservation that we have in the people of Kansas. Thanks, Bill.
Rob, I've got another question for you. Could you talk a little bit more about conservation on public lands and the preserves versus our newer work on private lands and some of the hurdles that we might face with conservation on private lands specifically?
Well, the bad news about conservation on private lands is that it's all private. The good news about conservation on private lands is that it's private. Private landowners typically take a great deal of pride in even things like having endangered species on their land. They take a great deal of pride in having healthy landscapes, and we harness the energy of that pride and the legacy that most private landowners want to leave for future owners to do conservation on private lands at a much larger scale geographically and at a much lower cost per acre than we could ever do in lands that we own. We simply can never get to a large enough scale to conserve entire ecosystems by owning land, either in our ownership or in government agencies. Those lands are important because they are proving grounds. They anchor conservation projects that expand across larger landscapes. But we have to have, and are very fortunate to have, the passion and the partnership of private landowners in our conservation. And the big comparison I would make is that it's a financial, and that is that when we do a conservation easement, we typically acquire the land for a dime on the dollars or thereabouts. We don't have an ongoing management expense that's borne usually very responsibly by private managers. And so the finances, the financial aspect of it. It allows us to be much more responsible with the money that our supporters give us, and much more effective across the landscape.
Thanks, Rob. Got another question here from Jan. What percentage of the wind farms in Kansas are located in areas that minimize impact following the good science? Is this something that needs legislation to be required?
Great question. I don't know this percentage of the wind turbines. I think there are 20 some wind farms in Kansas right now. Only 3 of those are poorly sited to any great extent. 2 in the Flint Hills and 1 in the Smoky Hills that we would have rather seen somewhere else. 2 of those were built before anyone was really paying attention to the science behind them. A third one is another longer story that involves some politics. But I'm really proud of the fact that almost all of the wind farms, if you throw a map up of where Site Wind Right says you should build wind farms, they're almost all in places where they should be. And that's a really powerful success that everyone on this call today can take part of the credit for as you've supported our work. What was the second part of the question?
It was, is this something that needs legislation to be required?
Oh yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
So the way Site Wind Right works is this. We work with developers and the companies that are buying the power from wind farms to help them find ecologically low risk areas to build wind farms. And we have found that the economics, the business risk mitigation of doing it right is much more powerful than the resolve of legislatures to pass or state agencies to enforce laws to site those wind energy facilities. And here's the thing. I've seen the legislature pass good laws and bad laws and then undo both. So I think I have more faith in the durability of economic drivers than I do legal drivers in this case. And I'm not sure that passing laws would do us a lot of good over the long haul. I'm certainly willing to entertain that. I was part of a conversation at the federal level that I thought might result in some federal regulations, at least around tax incentives for wind energy siting. I would have welcomed that. But by and large, economic drivers are more powerful, I think, than legal drivers when it comes to siting renewable energy.
Rob, can you talk a little bit more about how climate change will impact the work we've done so far in Kansas, and whether or not we're factoring climate change into our land and water protection strategies going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. I used to be, before all my technical skills atrophied, I used to be a fisheries guy, a fisheries biologist. And one of the things that concerns me most about climate change is that, and I'm just focusing in on this because something so near and dear to my heart, is that most prairie streams operate on very marginal hydrologic regimes, very marginal water budgets. And they also flow through soil types that are susceptible to erosion and flood events. And what climate change brings to us is much more dramatic drought and flood events that threaten those precious little stream jewels that flow through the prairie. And I think climate change has already begun to impact our stream resources. And so, yes, climate change has already affected much of what we do. I mentioned earlier that increasing atmospheric carbon has apparently begun to drive the invasion of woody species in the prairie, affected our need for fire. And it's virtually a part of everything we do going forward. Mitigating climate change is an overarching strategy for everything we do. I don't think we have our role in climate change figured out very well in Kansas or in the Great Plains, but it's pretty clear that mitigating atmospheric carbon is a part of that, and renewable energy is really important to that part of the equation.
Thanks, Rob. Can you say more about how and where Kansas TNC is involved in supporting monarch reproduction and migration?
Great question. Yeah, so all of the lands that we own are managed with that in mind. We are also part of, well, on our conservation easements also, for example, we don't allow broadcast spraying of herbicides, and that's one of the big threats to monarchs because it diminishes the milkweed resource that it needs and general plant diversity that monarchs rely on. So we don't allow broadcast spraying of herbicides on those properties, on properties that we own. We're also working with farmers and other land managers to implement agricultural practices like field border management, like the use of herbicides and insecticides that are less harmful to monarchs. It's a really important question.
All right. From Carol, what small and specific things are being done around the Blue River in Kansas City? I know Heidi Mell is on this call as well. I don't know if I can call her out, but Rob, you can take a stab at it, or Heidi, if you want to fill us in on that.
I'd be glad to have Kelly, either you or Heidi, either one respond to that question.
Great. Yeah, I can jump on that really quickly. You got it, Heidi? I'll let you take it.
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to unmute myself. Can you repeat the question specifically? What was it about the Blue River project?
Yeah, what small and specific things are being done to clean up and protect the Blue River near Kansas City?
Right, so I would point out that the majority of our work on the Blue River is focused on climate resilience. That the previous question that was tossed to Rob, we have an opportunity in the Blue River watershed to mitigate some of the worst flooding impacts and water quality impacts by protecting the headwaters upstream as Overland Park and Olathe and the metro area continues to grow. So we're working with a number of partners on strategic stream corridor protection in the headwaters, as well as best management practices for new developments that might go in. And, you know, I'm really excited about the Blue River project because there's a lot of energy around it and a lot of recognition of what a special river it is. And the Corps of Engineers Kansas City district is very interested in sort of redoing some of the channel lining that they did in previous decades. So as you move further down in the Blue River watershed, you get into more of the concrete lined channel flood projects that were commonplace maybe in the 50s and 60s, but now we recognize are not the best thing for the river. And so the Corps of Engineers has expressed interest in redesigning some of those concrete channels and returning them to a more natural state. So there's a lot of energy around the Blue River.
Yeah, I might add also that the work that we're doing in agriculture, and we are really very new and in a pioneering mode in how we work with crop producers. But the work that we're doing in agriculture in reduced tillage, reduced use of chemicals, cover crops, field borders and filter strips, and sort of smart agriculture, I think is probably some of the most important work that we'll do in terms of stream water quality, and will have a big impact on the Blue River as much of its drainage remains in agricultural production.
Thanks, Rob. Do you want to highlight any of our newer conservation projects? Anything that's brand new for us?
Well, yes. I mean, as I said, our agriculture work is probably one of our biggest challenges. We've also, you know, the Nature Conservancy doesn't buy land quite as much as we used to because, as I've said several times before, our money goes over a great deal more landscape if we're not buying land. But we have continued to buy strategic pieces of land, and including we've recently bought all the in-holdings at Smoky Valley Ranch so that we're able to manage black-footed ferrets and prairie dogs and burrowing owls and bison across the entire landscape there without in-holdings. We've done some similar things at Cheyenne Bottoms and elsewhere where acquiring land still makes really good sense to us. That and agriculture, and we also are ramping up our work with entities like USDA, the Ranchland Trust of Kansas, and others to do more conservation easements faster. And as I mentioned earlier, we're on a very steep learning curve about climate change and climate change policy and atmospheric carbon and its relationship to grazing and farming.
Okay, thanks, Rob. I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat. If anybody has any last thoughts or questions for Rob, feel free to type them in or unmute yourself. Otherwise, we'll let Rob get back to his busy schedule, and I want to thank everybody for joining us today. This has been really fun for us to share all of this work with you, and it's been a pleasure to see you all virtually.
Yeah, thank you all so much. What we do is literally impossible without you. So I can't say thank you enough. I'm humbled to have your support. Be well.